please welcome Adam.
Thank you. Thanks, Butch, and thank you, Jason, for inviting me, although I guess he's no longer the president, so he's not here today. So as Butch said, I write the Daylight Atheism blog on the Patheos network on the Atheist channel, and I've published several books. Currently, I'm serializing a new book called Commonwealth, a novel of utopia, and before that, I published with Andrew Murtaugh, Meta, on God, the Big Questions, and the Just City. And my talk today is, as you can see, on how white atheists can do better. This is from one of my son's favorite books, The Day the Crayons Quit. This is Beige Crayon. He's very sad. All right. So, I'd like to begin with Atheism has a bright future in America. The younger rising generations are the least religious in our country's history. Surveys of the millennial generation, usually defined as people born between 1982 and 2000, find that 1/4 of them are explicitly non-religious, a record. Just 40% of millennials say that religion is very important in their lives, and only 27% believe that the Bible is the literal word of God. And the generation after that, sometimes called Generation Z, only amplifies this trend. More than 1/3 of Gen Z teenagers say they're atheist, agnostic, or religiously unaffiliated. And according to the Christian polling firm Barna Research, just 4% of them hold a, quote, biblical worldview. This demographic shift has happened with startling speed within the last 2 to 3 decades, and it's shifting America's makeup in a big way. According to the latest General Social Survey data, Americans who say they have no religion now represent 23% of the population, which puts us in a statistical tie with Catholics and evangelical Christians as the largest religious demographic in the country. Religious in air quotes. I'd love to claim the credit for this. I'd love to be able to say that it was the fearless activism of the new atheist vanguard that broke the spell of religion. But I think the reality is that it's a self-inflicted wound. The culture warriors of the religious right chose their battles badly, especially LGBT rights and same-sex marriage. The younger generations grew up knowing out-of-the-closet gay and lesbian people, and the push for equal rights was an obvious step to them. By opposing it, the church has painted themselves as bigoted and archaic institutions that no decent person would want to be affiliated with. The awful clergy abuse scandal and the lengths that the churches went to sweep it under the rug was another gaping wound that they inflicted on themselves. Here's something else you should know about millennials and Gen Z. Not only are they the least religious, they're also the most racially diverse generations in American history. Among millennials, people who identify as non-white, by which I mean Hispanic, African American, Asian, or multiracial, make up 40% of the population. And among Gen Z, it's 47%. America is destined for a majority-minority future, and we're very nearly at the tipping point. And that's where I start getting worried, because now I'm going to name the elephant in the room. Atheism is white. I mean, really white. As recently as 2013, according to polling data, 3 out of 4 American atheists were white. And that's actually an improvement from a few years earlier, where it was as high as 80%. As our country steadily grows more diverse, the atheist community, meaning our conferences, our meetup groups, our activist groups, our published authors, remain lily white and mostly male. If you look around this room, you can see for yourself what I'm talking about. That's not to say you're not lovely people. I'll never say a bad word about people who invite me to speak. But there are predictable problems that arise when not everyone's voice is in the room. To be clear, there are good reasons why the atheist movement might have looked this way at the beginning, meaning mostly white. There are still a lot of places where to publicly declare your disbelief in religion is to go against a powerful tide of social pressure. It's to be expected that only the most privileged people would be able to do that and escape the backlash. It's especially hard to be an out-of-the-closet atheist when you're a minority from a traditionally religious community. In those circumstances, declaring yourself an atheist is a radical step, one that people will hear you saying as you want to cut ties with your family and reject your culture. And when you're part of a culture that genuinely does face external prejudice, bigotry, and threats, few people will be willing to divest themselves of that support network. Here's the atheist writer Alam Shah talking about this problem. He said, "My family was one of a large wave of Bangladeshi families who emigrated to the UK in the early 1970s. It was a hard time to be a young Bangladeshi in Britain, a time when pubs displayed signs saying, 'No blacks, no Irish, no dogs,' and violent racism was rife. We got used to the shouts of 'Go back home, you dirty packies,' which is a very bad slur, and lived in fear of physical abuse ranging from being spat at to being beaten up on the street. In these circumstances, it's not surprising that the Bangladeshi community was a close-knit and insular one. It was not only our shared experiences as immigrants that unified us, but also our shared religion. Islam was the religion that defined many of my cultural experiences as I was growing up. For many of the people I grew up with, being Bangladeshi is inseparable from being a Muslim." And this goes across cultures. Here's another person talking about the same problem. The head of I believe, Black Atheist of America, Mandisa Thomas. She says, "It can be extremely difficult to discuss religion objectively in the black community. Many have social, emotional, and financial stakes invested in this institution. So for one to even say they have doubts is like committing treason. To openly identify as an atheist in the midst of heavy religious influence can be next to impossible. And good luck finding other blacks who don't also believe. Though I was raised secular, a rarity in my community, I've had to endure ostracism from family and friends as a result of openly identifying as an atheist." So, as I said, there are reasons why the atheist community has often been majority white. But the issue is, if we don't make any special effort to correct it, the whiteness of atheism can become self-perpetuating. Consider how it looks from the viewpoint of people who are still part of these traditionally religious cultures. If they look to the atheist movement and see only white faces, they may well conclude that no one else from their community has ever made it out and found a safe haven among us, and that may discourage them from trying. Another issue is that if the atheist community is majority white, we're poorly positioned to speak to what people of other races care about. There are many issues that are invisible to us because they rarely impact us. Racist street harassment and intimidation that Alam Shah spoke about, the aggressive over-policing of minority communities and mass incarceration for relatively minor offenses, environmental racism, which means that poor and minority communities bear the brunt of lead in the water, smog in the air, and other pollutants, hostile and draconian immigration laws, unequal taxation, which ensures that schools in poor areas are starved of resources and the teachers are underpaid and overwhelmed, and more. So these are just a couple of the things that have been in the headlines quite a bit lately. So here's how Debbie Goddard of American Atheist puts it. I believe she's spoken here in the past. "I am frustrated that we, the movement, only seem to get involved with public education when a teacher puts Bible quotes on the walls of her classroom, when a football coach leads his high school team in prayer, when a science teacher spends time promoting intelligent design, when an administration prevents a student from starting an atheist club, or when a high school graduation is scheduled to take place in a church. Then we swoop in with our science advocates and our wall of separation to make everything right, but we don't seem to worry about the fact that the high school's graduation rate might be less than 50% and the shared science textbooks are older than the students." If the atheist community wants to be inclusive, if we want to be a place where non-white people feel welcome, it's not good enough to sit back and wait for them to come to us. And it's certainly not acceptable to say that our issues are the correct ones or the most important ones that everyone should care about above all else. Separation of church and state, or teaching evolution in schools, or science-based public policy, these things are important, but they're not going to seem as critical to you if you have to worry about finding a job, or whether it's safe for you to drink your tap water, or whether you'll be shot by the police. Obviously, being a white guy myself, I'm not saying that it's bad to be white. But what I am saying is that we can't assume that our views and our concerns are the most important ones or the only rational ones. If we want people to join our movement, we have to be a movement that speaks to what they care about. You have to give a little to get a little. Unfortunately, the problem doesn't stop at mere lack of inclusivity. There are also atheists who intentionally promote harmful stereotypes and outright racism. For instance, T.J. Kirk, the amazing atheist, a popular YouTube figure who sneers at black culture as, quote, a victim cult. This kind of bigotry makes people of color justifiably want nothing to do with us. This is how one of my colleagues on the Patheos Atheist channel responded to this. He said, I don't believe in God, but when I hear sentiments like this, I want to turn in my atheist card and go back to church. And it's not just angry shouters on YouTube that are the problem. These regrettable stereotypes can be heard from some of the best-known and most popular atheists out there. For instance, the best-selling atheist author Sam Harris has argued that to prevent terrorism, police and airport security should racially profile people who, quote, look like they could be Muslim, singling them out for searches, questioning, and scrutiny. He wrote an article called In Defense of Profiling. Exactly what Sam Harris thinks a Muslim looks like, he didn't explain. But it's nearly impossible to imagine what this could mean if it's not a crudely stereotypical suggestion to crack down on people with dark skin and beards. Real security experts will tell you that the best way to prevent terrorism is to do purely random checks, because if there's any pattern in who you look for, terrorists will just find someone who doesn't fit the profile. There are white and white-passing Muslims. There are even white-passing members of ISIS. So this slide is, which of these people look Muslim to you? Because they all are, except this is Sarah Hyder. She's Pakistani. I believe she's the head of Ex-Muslim Atheists of America. This is a white Muslim on YouTube. These are Muslims from the Philippines. But it doesn't end there. On his podcast, Sam Harris gave a sympathetic softball interview to the conservative ideologue Charles Murray, who wrote a book called The Bell Curve, which argues that black people are genetically predetermined to be less intelligent. At the same time, Harris has said that it's very hard to find a black guest who's intellectually honest and not, quote, contaminated by identity politics. What this implies is that, in Harris's mind, undeniably racist viewpoints like Murray's are somehow the neutral or the honest ones, whereas black people who merely defend their own rights are displaying bias. All right. Now I want to talk about Ahmed Mohamed. Some of you may remember this. Ahmed Mohamed was this nerdy Texas 14-year-old student interested in engineering who brought a homemade clock to school to show it off to his teachers. But because he was brown and Muslim, his school somehow assumed it was a bomb and had a ludicrously aggressive panic reaction, summoning the police to intimidate him and threatening him with expulsion if he wouldn't sign a confession on the spot without even talking to his parents or a lawyer. Here we have a case where a scientifically curious young person was being cruelly repressed by school administrators in an ignorant conservative community. Luckily, we have Richard Dawkins, the great science communicator, who heard about this episode and swooped in to defend the school. In a series of Twitter rants, he called Ahmed hoax boy, implying that he couldn't possibly have built the clock himself, and claiming that Ahmed must have wanted to get himself arrested for some bizarre reason. In the topper, he compared Ahmed to an ISIS child soldier. So this link here goes to this article. Whether or not Dawkins and Harris mean to be prejudiced, this is exactly the kind of thing that drives non-white people away from the atheist community. The knee-jerk aggressiveness, the rush to judgment, the presumption of guilt. They may insist that it's only Islam, the religion, they object to, not the people who practice it. But many wavering Muslims who are considering atheism, when they hear remarks like these, will hear a message of prejudice loud and clear. And their reaction is likely to be, okay, even if Islam isn't true, those atheists are a bunch of bigots. I don't want anything to do with those guys. Last but not least, there's Michael Shermer, publisher of Skeptic magazine. I could say a lot about Shermer, but let's start with this tweet, where he takes it upon himself to claim that women and people of color don't care about racism or sexism and want the rest of us to stop talking about it so much. The less said about this, the better. And then there's the time Shermer did a podcast with Stefan Molyneux, a Canadian white supremacist, and called him, quote, one of the most articulate podcasters for reason. When people criticized Shermer for this, he claimed that he'd never heard of Molyneux before and did no preparation, didn't even bother to Google him before speaking to him and broadcasting their interview to the world. This, by the way, is the first Google result for Stefan Molyneux. Stefan Molyneux is a far-right, white nationalist Canadian podcaster who is known for his promotion of scientific racism and white supremacist views. So that's skepticism for you. This is where we need to talk about that dreaded term, identity politics. Usually this phrase is used to dismiss activism by women or minorities who supposedly want special privileges on the basis of race or gender or religion. The reality is that everyone engages in identity politics, but when it's being done by a mainstream or a privileged group, we don't call it that. We just call it politics. When Christian churches demand that the Ten Commandments be posted in schools and courthouses, or when Trump-supporting Republicans rally to ban immigration from Latin American countries, or when rich people lobby for cuts in the capital gains tax rate, what is that if not identity politics? Religion, race, and class are all aspects of people's identities, and that's true whether you're a rich white secular person or a poor black Christian. And of course, by any reasonable definition, the atheist movement is also a kind of identity politics, seeking to organize and to act on the basis of our shared identity as atheists. Atheists like the ones I've been talking about, who insist that their own viewpoint is the neutral or the default one, and it's those other people who are polluting the movement with biases and identity politics, are like the parable of the fish who doesn't know what water is. Part of being a rational person means recognizing that everyone has biases which influence and shape their views. And another part of being rational is acknowledging that you're the least qualified person when it comes to detecting your own biases. Okay, so by this point, maybe I'm depressing you. So now let me change gears and let's talk about how atheists can be better allies. Just to establish my bona fides at the outset, I'm not claiming that I'm the expert or that I have all the answers. This stuff is hard to get right, and I think reasonable people will disagree sometimes about the best course of action in response to racism. As an illustration of that, let me tell you about my friend Sarah Brosh. I met Sarah in 2009 at an event in New York organized by the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I admired her writing about growing up Jehovah's Witness and how she escaped at great personal cost from that belief system, as well as her human rights work. Her human rights work on behalf of women in the Islamic world. We struck up a correspondence, and she agreed to write guest posts for my site, which she did on occasion for the following 2 years. That would have been until 2011. Now, do you remember a story from about a year ago about how a white Yale grad student called the cops on a black student for sleeping in a student lounge? Sarah was the white student. At the time this happened, I hadn't been in correspondence with her for over a year. Regardless, when I heard about it, I wrote a post saying that I was shocked. It seemed so incongruous with what I thought I knew about her, but I absolutely condemned what she did. I still got a flood of hate mail from commenters who thought that wasn't enough, and who wanted me to delete everything she'd ever written on my site because, well, honestly, I didn't see what that would achieve. The view I still hold is that whether or not there was anything in Sarah's history of writing which foreshadowed this act, for the record, I don't believe there was, then either way, that was an important data point for us to evaluate her character. To me, it feels dishonest to try to change or cover up the past. Did I do enough in this case? Should I also have purged my site of everything Sarah had ever written, deleted any trace that I was ever associated with her? I don't know. Maybe I didn't get this right. I bring it up because I don't want anyone to think that I'm claiming infallibility for myself. But with that proviso in mind, let's talk about some things atheists can do better on race. First, let's learn about the evidence of implicit bias. In many areas of life, minorities still face obstacles that we white people don't. One of the classic examples are studies which send out hundreds of identical resumes to job postings. Identical, that is, except for the name on top. Half the resumes have a white-coded name, like Emily or Greg, and half of the resumes have a black-coded name, like Lakeisha or Jamal. In every other respect, they're exactly the same. Then the researchers see how many get callbacks for interviews. Guess what happens? This is the result. A white name yields as many more callbacks as an additional 8 years of experience. It's not just job interviews where this happens either. People of color are shown fewer houses and worse houses by realtors than white homebuyers. When they get car loans, they're charged higher interest rates than white buyers with similar credit histories. In school, black kids are more likely to be punished by teachers for the same misbehavior and less likely to get into gifted programs, even with the same test scores. Black people are less likely to get a response when they write letters to local government. Black hospital patients often get less effective treatment for pain. The list goes on and on. If you're a white person, this kind of discrimination is invisible to you because you never experience it. And if you don't know about it, you may think that minorities tend to be poor because they just aren't trying hard enough, that they're lazy or they lack a work ethic. If you've heard the term white privilege, this is what it means. Certain things will always seem easier to you just by virtue of the kind of society we all live in. Now, to be clear, the fact that people show these prejudiced tendencies doesn't mean that they're evil racists doing evil racist things. It means we live in a society which privileges white voices above others, and we've all absorbed that unconscious bias, along with all the other ideas and attitudes we're bathed in that we pick up without realizing it. And there's no reason to believe that the skeptical community is an exception. If you want to counter this kind of prejudice, you can do it through consciousness raising, which is the ability to see the world the way someone from a different background than you sees it. All human beings have the capacity for this, but it doesn't just come naturally. It's a skill that has to be learned and practiced. The worst thing you can do is shoot from the hip and claim you intuitively understand someone else's problems or what they care about. For example, we atheists often have nothing but good to say about science and the scientific method. But if you're a black person, you might not think of science as an unmitigated blessing. The first thing that comes to mind might be the Tuskegee experiment, where the US government recruited poor southern black men who had contracted syphilis and then deliberately didn't treat them in order to study the progression of the disease. You might also think about Sarah Baartman, an 18th century South African woman of the Khoi tribe who was brought to Europe and treated like a zoo exhibit by some of the most eminent scientists of the day, including George Cuvier, the founding father of modern paleontology, in a bid to prove that black people were primitive and racially inferior. This is a picture of Sarah Baartman from Cuvier's book, Illustrations of the Natural History of Mammals. She was classified in between a wild sheep and a langur monkey. After she died, her body was displayed as an exhibit in a museum in France. Or, if you're a Latino person, you might think of Cornelius Rhodes, the first director of the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and one of the pioneers of chemotherapy, but who also wrote a letter in which he boasted that he had intentionally experimented on and killed poor Puerto Ricans by injecting cancer cells into them. This is work he was doing, I believe, in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Puerto Rico for the Rockefeller Foundation. He said of Puerto Rico, "What this island needs is not public health work, but a tidal wave or something to totally exterminate the population. I've done my best to further the process of extermination by killing off 8 and transplanting cancer into several more." For the record, when people found this letter, he claimed it was a joke. If you want to practice consciousness raising, one of the best things you can do is read often and widely. It's an empathy expander, but it only works if you intentionally seek out different perspectives. How many atheist blogs written by people of color do you read? What was the last book, fiction or nonfiction, you read that deals with racial issues or that was written by a non-white person? If you want to expand your reading list, I have a couple suggestions here. The first book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, talks about how mass incarceration, especially for drugs, has taken the place of Jim Crow in the South. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks was about a black cancer patient whose a sample of her cancer was taken and decades after she died has become the basis for a lot of modern biology, without her or her family's consent. Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me is a series of essays, takes the form of letters he wrote to his son about growing up black in America. Evicted by Matthew Desmond won the Pulitzer Prize. It's about how housing instability and eviction court perpetuates poverty and housing segregation among black Americans. And this last one was one of my favorites, Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly. It's about the black female mathematicians who helped us win the space race. There was a movie about this. If you want more suggestions, got a couple more. And if you prefer to watch rather than read, I can recommend the movie Dear White People, which then became a show on Netflix. It's sort of a story about college and social life from a black perspective. So the next thing I want to talk about is paying attention to representation. What do people think of when they think of atheists? If they know anything about us, it's likely to be these guys, the Four Horsemen: Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. No women, no people of color. The most diverse thing about these guys is whether they have British accents. We've also had too many atheist conferences whose speakers were all or nearly all white men, maybe with an occasional woman thrown in for variety. This is not good for us. We need to counteract the perception that atheism is a white guy's clubhouse, and that means making a deliberate and focused effort to be inclusive. It also helps if our Facebook group banners don't look like this. You can see Neil deGrasse Tyson kind of shoved in there, and then maybe it doesn't. Oh, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali here, and all the rest of white guys. To be clear, this isn't a call for tokenism. If you put one black person on the board of your atheist group and think you've solved the problem, you're doing it wrong. Or if you expect one person of color to be able to speak on behalf of all people of color, you're still doing it wrong. What I'm saying is that we should have speaker lists, board members, and conference panels that are reflective of and proportional to America's true diversity of ages, ethnicities, and genders. Remember what I said earlier about Gen Z, half of them are not white. Sometimes this will be difficult. Sometimes it will mean making an effort to reach out to people you might not have thought of reaching out to before. Sometimes it will take us out of our comfort zones. That's a good thing. Here's one that's going on right now. I've been following this on Facebook. Center for Inquiry, one of the largest atheist groups, I believe has no people of color on its board. And several people have been hounding them about this, and they just recently announced a new board member who's Julia Sweeney, also white. And this quote is by Kavin Senapathy, who is the host of the Point of Inquiry podcast. She in particular has been hammering on this. She said, "I've been talking to a few board members about this, and the answer to my question, how many non-white individuals were considered for election to CFI's board, the answer appears to be 0. One person I asked about why they elected yet another white person to the board. Finding people that want to serve and have the appropriate qualifications isn't easy." How do you define appropriate qualifications? And that brings me to my next point about what we can do. Listen, it sounds simple, but it's not easy. If a person of color tells you about bias or poor treatment they've experienced, it means that they trust you enough to confide in you. The worst thing you can do is to start coming up with reasons to dismiss that concern, or to tell them they probably didn't experience what they say they did. Also, don't lecture them about what they should do if they haven't specifically asked for advice. I know we like to solve problems, but trust me, in this case, it's not helpful. Just offer sympathy and sit with the discomfort for a while. So this quote from the writer Ijoma Oluo, I like. "The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fighting racism wherever you find it, including in yourself." My last suggestion is to give more money and power to minorities. We should be seeking out and patronizing small businesses owned by minority entrepreneurs. Those of us who have the power to hire for jobs should be looking for qualified minority candidates. We should be donating money to scholarship funds that help historically disadvantaged communities. We have a couple of these in the atheist movement. One is the Black Skeptics First in the Family Humanist Scholarship Program. We should also be supporting and partnering with activist groups who address issues that minorities care about, like over-policing and mass incarceration, or affordable housing, or immigrant detention at the borders. Here's a couple that I have personally supported in the past. Maybe you might like them. Foundation Beyond Belief, the atheist group, is also quite good. There's just one more point I want to make, which is that I don't view these things that I've spoken about today as optional. A more diverse atheist movement isn't a nice to have or a bonus we might try to strive for after achieving our other goals. Whether we realize it or not, the stakes are high. As I said at the beginning, just as America is becoming more secular, it's also becoming more racially diverse. If atheists fail to reach out and make inroads with people of color, we'll be committing a sort of slow-motion demographic suicide. We'll be consigning ourselves to irrelevance as a shrinking cul-de-sac of white people in an increasingly diverse world. Now, there are some signs that we're doing better and that the atheist community is diversifying. I've tried today to quote many different people of positions of prominence in the atheist movement who are not white. I mentioned a 2013 survey from the Baartman Group, which found that atheism is becoming slightly more racially and ethnically inclusive. But now is not the time to pat ourselves on the back and declare that the job is done. We have a lot of work left to do if we want to build a secular community that's as diverse as America. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Adam. We're going to do Q&A now. We have plenty of time, so if anybody has a question, please wait for the microphone to come to you, speak into the mic, and if you have a follow-up question, hang on to it for the time being. Thanks.
I just have a question.
Sure.
Asking Adam if you put his email address up there.
Oh, yeah. I don't have it written anywhere, but I can give it to you after the talk.
Okay.
Come, remind me.
I couldn't hear you. I asked for his email address. Contact somebody.
You can, yeah, I do. You can contact me through my website, also daylightatheism.org, or Twitter occasionally.
I know I've heard conversations here about how we can reach out to minorities better than we are, and trying to think about places where we could kind of advertise. I hope this doesn't come off wrong, but my experience is the black communities, Latino, they are very, very, very religious.
No, I mean, you're not wrong. And I think there's kind of a, like I said, I think there's kind of a chicken and egg problem.
I was going to use those exact words.
Where because those communities are so religious, atheists are, like looked down upon or ostracized. And I think the people in those communities who are atheists tend to stay in the closet, which makes them hard to, I don't want to say target, but hard to reach out to, hard to communicate with.
Right, and I don't even know where you would begin to go and try and welcome those people, into, if they're looking for some place away from their churches or religions or whatever, where do you go?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Because obviously people who, the traditional hub of their social life is the church are not going to be receptive to atheist advertising. I think, I don't know how effective internet ads are in general, but I feel like this is a good invention for atheists because it really kind of levels the playing field. It makes it easy to reach out to a large number of people. And also it makes it easy to reach out to people in private. I know that Facebook and groups like that have caught some flack for the narrowness with which you can target advertising. I don't want to say that advertising to black people is as simple as checking a box. But I think internet forums are definitely a good place for that. And I think, this LGBT Center, this is a good place to start. I feel like this is a very good space, and I'm glad that we're meeting here, that you're meeting here. Because I feel like there must be people from the surrounding community of all kinds who come here. Maybe more of them need to know that there is a humanist group that meets here regularly, and maybe they'd like to, stop in sometime.
I mean, even when you were talking about no black people on the board of whatever that was. Center
for Inquiry, yeah.
We couldn't put a black person on the board if we wanted to because we have no black members.
Of course, and that's, it has to start from the bottom and it has to rise up. And of course, this is not a change that's going to happen overnight. I feel like the situation as it exists now has been building for many, many years. Like I said, there are reasons why the atheist movement started out mostly white, but it has to be a trend that we don't just passively accept. And not being a black person, I don't want to say well, this is where black people congregate, this is where we can reach out to them. But I feel like, there has to be, there are people in the atheist group, in the atheist movement who are already non-white, and they may have better ideas about this than me. Because I think the other thing you need is word of mouth, and you need those cultural ties that information can be disseminated through. And again, it's a chicken and egg problem because you have to start by having people of color who know where to reach other people of their same background. But I feel like it can, just as it's been like a positive spiral in one direction, of increasing whiteness, it can be a spiral of diversity in the other direction too. But those first few steps are the hardest.
I like the idea of posting notices here at the LGBTQ Center. I think, assuming that there are no ways of reaching people is just maybe forgiving ourselves for not reaching out. I know that churches have been offering English lessons to new refugees, and I feel like we could be offering some services to people oppressed by religion in their own country. Also, there are a number of independent coffee houses where we could post notices. I know that there are some liberal organizations such as Make the Road Pennsylvania, which is predominantly Hispanic. We could be reaching out. It may be that none of their members would like to attend this group's meetings, but at least we could try to establish bonds with them by going to their meetings.
Definitely, like letting them know that you're there is a good step. Something else I've heard suggested is you can volunteer to accompany people to immigration court, people who are in deportation hearings or people who are applying for citizenship. A lot of times there are local groups that will allow you to volunteer to help like escort them to court, sort of like be a native guide through the process, I guess. Another good way to meet people who are not white. Definitely, if there are immigration or immigrant rights groups in the area, those would be good people to make common cause with. I know you mentioned you're doing like highway cleanups and other community service activities. Like, could you consider maybe partnering with an immigrant group or other community groups that are also involved in this sort of work?
There are some terrific liberal community groups that we could be reaching out to, I'm sure. Maybe it's a little weird to say we. This is my first meeting, but but I'd like to keep coming. So yeah.
There you go.
If I could address that real quick, we do have one project in the works behind the scenes that most people might not know about. We've been compiling a series of helplines for secular help groups, suicide prevention, alcohol prevention, things like that, that we're going to work. We call it our flyer project, and it's in the works right now. And Paula has found a translator to help translate that into Spanish and Arabic. And we want to, once we get everything compiled and get some things printed out, we're going to talk to the membership about getting out into the community and trying to put that out. And I think those suggestions are fantastic. We should try and get these into more minority areas.
One more thought I had, without making too many assumptions about the partisan makeup of this of this community, but a lot of democratic political organizations have heavy participation from people of color. So if you're doing get out the vote drives or phone banking or door knocking for candidates, especially with an election coming up next year, is another good way to meet people who are outside your usual social circles.
I joined the NAACP of Easton. I've been a member for 4 years, but I don't find any, friendship. When I go to meetings, it bothers me because they start with a prayer, they end with a prayer. Oh. I miss the first prayer because I always go in late. But I haven't found any friendly relationships.
Yeah, that makes it tough. And and of course, as the one white person in the room, you certainly don't want to be telling them how to do things. So that makes it difficult. But if it's a large group, I can almost guarantee that there are probably people in the room who also don't really care about that prayer, but maybe don't feel like they want to be the one troublemaker who speaks up about it. But like getting them to identify themselves is hard. But if you are in conversation with them, if you ever happen to mention that you belong to an atheist or a humanist group, sometimes, all you can do is wait for them to come to you. Maybe there is someone else in that room who feels the same way but hasn't spoken up until now. And maybe they know that if there's at least one other person they can talk to about it.
So I have the mic now. Just for the record, this group is, I don't know, how old are we, Butch? More than 10 years old? Yeah, so we have had a few women of color join, and one in particular who I became really good friends with, and she would bring people from the black community to our meetings, and like she could never convince them to come back. But she kept coming. She came for about 2 years, and then she actually transferred her job, so she's no longer here. But yeah, we have had a few people of different races that have joined, and not. I think we've been very welcoming and stuff, but they've been trying to, and I've had some conversations with them about how we can get more diversity, and it is always very difficult for them to be in that position.
Yeah, of course.
You know,
Like I'm
and-
sure it's difficult to feel like you're the black
Yeah.
ambassador, or and
right?
even
Exactly.
without casting any aspersions on you or on this group, sometimes it just feels strange to be the one person in a room who
Yes.
doesn't look like everyone else. Just like I'm sure any of us would feel some mild discomfort if you were the one white person in a room, full of people speaking Spanish, or a room full of black people, because
Right.
you feel that everyone else there shares some experience or set of assumptions that you don't have. And even with the best intentions in the world, that's hard to overcome.
Yes, I've been that person too. I worked on a inner city school, and there were 3 white teachers, and they all thought we were sisters. It was kind of funny, and it's just like, okay, so that might be like me from my white privilege background. I'm wondering, do they feel that way when they're the only minorities in a group of all white people?
I'm sure
so we anyway, I don't know. I just wanted to know, for the record, we have had a few members that are
student groups
from
might
America.
also be a good place to look.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if the Secular Student Alliance has any affiliates around here, like local colleges, even local high schools. They will organize groups of non-religious students. And because younger generations are less religious, across the board, this is also a good place to look for people who are not white, who may also be less traditionally religious.
I always wondered if all atheists were Democrats, and that turns out not to be the case. I went to a meeting in Memphis, and there were 2 guys that I met there, really nice guys, but they were definitely racist and they were definitely Republican. And they were, had the right to, they were carrying guns, some of them, one of them.
In my experience, atheists skew more liberal, but obviously not universally. And there are, I believe the amazing atheist who I mentioned earlier is a Trump supporter. They do exist. I don't fully understand it, but
Yeah, the trouble is there aren't enough black people to go around. That's the trouble. I'm involved with the Unitarian Church, and their big problem is we don't have enough blacks coming to the church. Well, we have like 2, and that's really a pretty good number.
yeah, I also attend the Unitarian Universalist Church in Long Island, and it's the same thing there. And I think in some ways the UUs have the same issue that atheists do, in that we tend to be upper class and liberal and mostly white.
Yeah.
And historically there has just been this gulf of not suspicion, but like mutual incomprehension, possibly.
The only thing that seemed to draw the attention of atheists is I've been known to wear T-shirts occasionally that are maybe a little reactive, friendly neighborhood atheists, something like that. That isn't the one that gets the reaction, but I have a Freethinker sweatshirt from Freedom from Religion Foundation. I got a lot of people saying, "I like your shirt," and a lot of them are black.
Oh yeah.
And there's another one I have that says, "Make racism wrong again."
Very good.
That gets a similar reaction. So maybe we just have to wear a lot of shirts. I don't know.
I like this idea.
Yeah, kind of on that topic, I think as much as humanists, we kind of fight against that idea that being religious makes you moral, because so many people make that assumption. We know that's not true. Sometimes we're caught off guard by that opposite being true, that not being religious does not make you moral also. Like being an atheist, as we've seen, there's certainly plenty of very immoral atheists that are out there. So that kind of opposite assumption sometimes happens.
Speaking of shirts, I have a shirt that says, "We're all mutts," and I really like to wear that one. But my teen years, I grew up as a hanger-on of the civil rights movement. I mean, my mother was involved, and so I spent summers at a place called Fellowship Farm where they brought in the freedom riders and stuff to talk to us. They brought in people from North Philadelphia. I just thought the world was multiracial. Of course, I was living in North Philadelphia, and that might have something to do with it. Moving to the Lehigh Valley, I have never seen such a white place. Let me just tell you that. And I don't know what to do about it. What?
You've not been to Michigan.
No. It's worse.
Northern Michigan, oh my God.
But I think it all goes back to segregation in housing, and we can't do much about that. But that's when everything
that's
fell
what makes
apart.
it really tough. Like I mentioned that book Evicted by Matthew Desmond, that a lot of these, this like lack of, I say like this geographic separation between people of different races is not an accident. This is the way American society was planned. If you look at street maps of Baltimore from the 1910s, there were neighborhoods, the ghettos, that were explicitly designated black neighborhoods, and white people white people lived elsewhere, and black people were not allowed to live in white neighborhoods. Even though segregation is no longer legally enforced, the racial makeup of these neighborhoods has not changed. Mm-hmm. Just knowing where segregation was in effect 90, 100 years ago predicts how a neighborhood looks today. And that, another thing makes it really difficult to overcome, like the suburbs too. The fact that America's suburbs are mostly white is not an accident. That's how it was planned. Because if you were black, you could not get a housing loan in the 50s to move into these new suburban tracts that were springing up around the major cities. Long Island, where I come from, is very, very much still dealing with this problem.
I don't think Allentown is dealing with it. That's what I would say.
Yeah, we're not dealing with it.
To me. Okay.
Person. Let me tell you, but we have neighbors. We don't have neighbors. We have a 19-acre farm.
I know, but we didn't always live there. Anyway, okay.
But we've always had fights there. Who's got it?
I do have a little good news here. My daughter lives in Coopersburg in a very affluent area, and there are 2 black families that live right across from her. And I don't know how that happened, but that to me I was excited positively when I saw that, and I guess they had enough money.
I think in a lot of these places, this is very slowly changing, and to some extent, it's going to have to change because, like I said, the younger, the up-and-coming generations are more diverse than the ones that preceded them, and these people have to live somewhere. So I think a lot of neighborhoods, just by sheer demographic momentum, are going to start becoming more diverse. But that, that's a process that can take decades.
I hope so. I live in a 55-plus community, but Traditions of America bought it, and there are no blacks in that community. There's one Asian family I hear, and I brought that up to the people. Where are they? And then I thought myself, now if I was black, that would take an awful lot of courage for me,
absolutely.
Or if I was Hispanic, to buy into a community like that, because how would I fit in easily?
And I think this is something that atheists obviously do have some experience about. When you live in a majority religious country or a majority religious society, that we can have these same sorts of feelings like, I don't fit in here, I don't belong. These people are not like me. But the advantage we have is that you can't tell that you're an atheist by looking at you. So we can blend in when we want to. We can bow our heads and go along with the prayer. We cannot speak up. But there are people, if the thing that makes you separate is your skin color, you can't hide that.
All right, one more question over here.
Got my thought back. I think today people either want to claim atheism because it's just a statement they want to make, and some of it I think has been necessitated by the evangelicals. It's a fighting back. It's watching them take over the government and all of that. Do you think this new generation of people that never found religion as just being important one way or another will kind of not have to claim as atheism? They're not going to label themselves either way?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I think this sounds bad, but I'll explain. I think in some ways atheism is a reactive viewpoint. because it would not occur to you to call yourself an atheist unless you lived in a society that was mostly religious. If everyone was an atheist, that word wouldn't exist. So I think that younger generations do sort of have this advantage that they are not growing up in time when it was assumed that everyone was religious. And I think this is something, so I'm 37. I think this is something I have sort of lived through because I remember the George W. Bush years and how he explicitly made appealing to evangelicals a crucial part of his campaign strategy. And, just within the past 15, 20 years, like the demographic makeup of American society has changed dramatically. I remember when same-sex marriage was the issue that, the red-hot dividing issue of society. And now it's the law of the land, and it doesn't even seem that controversial anymore. It's hard for me to believe how vigorously people were fighting about this just 10 years ago. And it's become a complete non-issue. And I think that is kind of a sign of the way religion is losing influence, and that these things that used to be these like culture war issues, these dividing controversies, are becoming less relevant. Abortion, sadly, is an exception. But yeah, I think as younger generations grow up with the assumption that not everyone is Christian, not everyone is religious, that this is something that will just become normal to them. That's something I'm looking forward to. Unfortunately, it may just mean we find other things to fight about, as with this race issue.
I teach ninth grade algebra, and my 14-year-old students, several of them that were not listening to me talk about algebra in class, apparently were talking about religion instead. One of them jumped up and yelled at the other, "You're an atheist?" So that happened in class with 14-year-olds. And he goes, "Yeah." And all the other students start looking around. They're going, "Ooh," and they were waiting for it to be a fight. And then the first student who said it was like, "Oh, okay." And then it sat down, and I said, "Can we get back to math?" And
That's great.
they were not listening to me. Anyone else have questions? I try not to make any statements one way or another, just being a teacher in a public school.
Yeah, I agree.
No, in the past, I have told students that I'm a humanist, so I'll say it that way. But most of my students are Christians, and I don't want that to be divisive at all. So, but I just told them, sit back down, get back to math. So.
And I think, if anything, the U.S. might be heading for this future, like Scandinavian countries are kind of in the lead on this, where a lot of people will sort of nominally say they're Christian if you ask them, but it doesn't really have any particular meaning or relevance to their lives. It's just a box they check on a form. I think that's the way we're heading. I don't think we're going to become a nation of firebrand atheists. I think religion is just going to slowly recede in relevance.
So I noticed on that graph that the number of Catholics was really high. Just for the record, if you were born to Catholic parents, they never let you off their records.
That's true.
So
Mormons
though the Mormon, a lot of the religions, the number of people reported is really skewed.
Yeah, there are a huge number. I believe something like 1 in 10 Americans considers themselves ex-Catholic. But yes, there is also that problem of people who have like a nominal religious identity, that the Christmas and Easter Christians. I believe this is derived from self-reports. So hopefully it will evade the problem of churches that count people as members who aren't actually members. Right. But there is that same thing of like this 25, 26% of Americans who consider themselves Catholic, how many of them actually go to church? Probably not that many.
Right. So ex-Catholics are actually, according to the Catholic Church, they are fallen away Catholics that need to come back.
Or
they won't they won't take your name off the roster. I've written several letters. And I'm still on the roster.
Or there are also some Catholics, like my mother-in-law, who says like she considers herself Catholic, but if the priest says something, she's also quite liberal, and if she says something the priest disagrees with, she just doesn't care. She says like, "Oh, who is he to tell me how to live my life?"
When I was in the Netherlands in last November. In the town that my friend lived in, we were walking through the town, and there was a church, and I said, "Do you go to that church?" "Oh," she says, "we're Christian, but we don't go to church." And she says, "Hardly anybody does in this town." She said, "We really are a secular nation."
There was an article I read.
So if Mr. who wins the election next year, I'm going to move to the Netherlands.
There are worse places. There was an article I read recently about this. I said that I believe 1/5 of church buildings in the Netherlands have been converted to other uses. Like, converted to other uses, like one-fifth. Within the last 10 years, though. And they become things like bookstores or bars or restaurants or community centers or affordable housing because they have these gorgeous old church buildings, but no one goes there anymore. So they're being put to better uses. This is happening all over Europe and even in traditionally religious countries like France and Spain. You know, it makes me feel very hopeful for the future.
I guess we're ending, but on a negative note, to end on a negative note, I'm not as hopeful because of the Supreme Court mix and the power of a few using evangelical religion, whatever, to continue to maintain that mix and more, even more conservative.
Yeah, I'm very much of two minds about this. And I agree that I wish I could have better news, but I feel like on a legal front, America does not look like it's heading down a good path. I think there are going to be a lot of special privileges for Christianity written into the law in the years to come. But I think the bright side of this, and the silver lining to this cloud, is that this is what is causing the acceleration of America's atheist demographic. People who feel that religion has become so politicized they want nothing to do with it. I think that trend began in the US in the 90s and it's only accelerating. And for the record, this is the same thing that happened in Europe. The reason that Europe has become so irreligious is because of these powerful state-established churches who are just, part of the government, part of the law. The United Kingdom still has a certain number of spots reserved in Parliament for Anglican bishops. But it is that melding of state and church that has caused people to turn away from religion. And that is what happened in Europe, and I think the Republicans appear bent on taking the U.S. down the same path. They want evangelical Christianity to be the official state-established, state-supported religion. But that makes people believe it less, not more.
Martha and I want to remind you that everyone here that, we do hold concerts in our home. And the next one is on a Sunday, October 27th. And it will be the Druckenmillers. Any of the local singer-songwriter scenes around here, you'll know that they are very, very well liked. And as those of you who came to the LBH picnic know, that we have a pretty good place to have a concert.
Bring all your friends of color.
Definitely.
Yeah. We could even have a Arab or something like that.
Yeah, that would be fine too.
Yeah. We don't discriminate. Explain that equation.
Oh, come on.
Imaginary numbers, come on. It says the square root of -4 equals 2. It's all fun and games until someone loses an eye. It should be 2i.
I understood it.
Okay. It's not funny when I have to explain the joke. Anyone else?
Any other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank Adam.
Thank you, everyone.
Round of applause, please. And this talk should not be the end of the conversation for us. I want to appreciate Laura, a new member, coming in and challenging us with some suggestions. Everybody should do that. Any ideas that we can do, because this is very important, I think. So, again, thank you, Adam, for your presentation.